Hello friends, James Stevenson back with a video explaining the four charts that I tweeted out yesterday. Let me share the Loki's bedcam with you and show you what Loki is up to. He has so far not eaten his breakfast, but maybe at some point, let me grab some kibbles here, maybe at some point he'll be interested in eating some kibbles. Alright, so we'll have the Loki cam there for you. Let me share my desktop with you and show you the tweet. 4 years ago, Almington Cap asked me, how does GM's debt compare to Tesla when you set debt alongside revenue, free cash flow, and earnings per share? I spelled those out here in kind of an annoying way with the brackets, but that's the accepted way of adding information to a quote that was not actually in it to begin with. Neither of us knew what 2019 through 2022 would hold back then, but I just created 4 new charts that answer his question. So let's look at these 4 charts. Here's one of them. You can see that pretty well, but I'll cheat it down just a little bit. There, that's a little bit better. Look. I'll take it. Okay, so here is the long-term debt. The titles for these charts are on the y-axis instead of being above the chart because you don't need a title above the chart in a case where we're only showing one kind of thing. In the case of this one, we're just showing the long-term debt for both of these two companies, Tesla and General Motors, and this is a log scale here, a logarithmic scale, as you can tell by glancing at the labels. For every even increment that the y-axis rises by, we're doubling the amount. So you've got 1 billion here, 2 billion, 4 billion, 8 billion, 16 billion, 32 billion, 64 billion, and then only after passing 64 billion of long-term debt do we find the General Motors numbers plot. They've been at more than $64 billion worth of long-term debt ever since 2017. Why was their debt lower back here? Because they had just declared bankruptcy in 2008 and only re-emerged in 2009 with a fresh balance sheet, a new company, after being bailed out by the US government. So they had less debt back here because the General Motors company had just started, at least under its current equity shares. What was Tesla doing back in 2010? Tesla was a very, very small company indeed back then. So they had less than $1 billion worth of debt in 2013 and before, and that amount rose as they needed to ramp up Model S and then Model X and then Model 3 out of Fremont, peaking between 8 and 16 billion worth of long-term debt here in 2019. And then when Tesla became profitable over these full fiscal years that followed, they borrowed less money. They funded their own operation and they paid down their long-term debt early, even though it wasn't due yet. They went ahead and paid down their long-term debt below 8 billion and then below 4 billion and then last year below 2 billion. And there's a little bit of debt left, but it's very small compared to Tesla's cash balance. Tesla's cash is more than 20 billion now and has been for a while. Okay, what's our next chart here? John wanted us to compare the debt against the revenue. So here's the revenue chart. Now the labels on these for GM I've labeled over 2018 on all these charts because that was the information that was available at the time. So again, we see a log scale here. Tesla's revenue was very low back here when all they were selling was the original Roadster. They only ever sold 2,300 of those, I think, lifetime before retiring that model. So, you know, $1 billion worth of revenue was pretty good in 2013 for Tesla when they were just starting to ramp up Model S here. And they added Model X, and then in 2017 Model 3 came in. And right around then is the time that John Engel was questioning Yeah, the debt is a lot more for GM, but GM's revenue is a lot larger. They're up here over 128 billion. Between 128 and 256 billion. That's where GM's been every year this whole time, with the exception of 2020 and 2021, the COVID and the chip shortage, the supply chain challenges of 2021 brought GM's revenue down temporarily below 128 billion, and they popped back up over it again. What's Tesla been doing since then? Well, they grew, from between 16 and 32 billion to 32 billion in 2020, past 64 billion, and are on their way to 128 billion worth of revenue. May get there this year. So that's what the revenue picture looks like. John would not have believed that this was going to happen at the time, 4 years ago, which was his point. He wanted to say, hey, GM makes way more revenue than Tesla does, and that's why they have so much more debt. All right, what's the next chart? It's the adjusted automotive free cash flow in billions. Friends, this is the most generous metric I can find if you want to talk free cash flow for General Motors. This is the number they report in their earnings releases. But if you go to a place like Yahoo Finance and try to find their actual free cash flow, they'll give you the total corporate free cash flow, which includes their financing arm. It used to be GMAC. That company went bankrupt with General Motors back in 2008. So now it's Ally Bank is the General Motors financing arm. They make GM free cash flow negative some of the time. So GM prefers to share adjusted automotive free cash flow, which has a ton of adjustments underneath it before they get to the number they want to tell you is their free cash flow. So that number was pretty high back in 2016, between 6 and 8 billion worth of free cash flow. You can see we don't have a log scale here. This is a straight y-axis. And they had less than 2 billion worth of free cash flow here in 2019 when Tesla was growing past that point. You can see since 2017, every year, Tesla's free cash flow has been greater. I'm calling it adjusted automotive free cash flow here, even though Tesla reports no such thing. So for Tesla, this is just their total corporate free cash flow. But for GM, it's this adjusted automotive division free cash flow only after they make adjustments to it. So that number was over 10 billion last year. I don't think we're going to see this number continue at this trajectory, but I do think we're going to see Tesla's free cash flow continue along this trajectory up and to the right. Expect GM to pull back from this greater than 10 billion free cash flow number soon, and perhaps for a while. And next we see GAAP earnings per share. So GM GAAP earnings per share have been between $0 and $10 every year, with the exception of 2017, which was also a tough year for Tesla. This was the lowest earnings Tesla had per share in 2017. Since that time, Tesla has been up every quarter, or every year, I should say, every fiscal year since 2017, passing $0 to have positive earnings, GAAP earnings per share in 2020, and then a much higher number in 2021, and then a much higher number than that in 2022. Now, I have noted my chart crime below the x-axis labels here. Note, Tesla EPS adjusted to exclude the August 2020 5-for-1 split and the August 2022 3-for-1 split. Why did I do that? Because John Engel's question was asked in March of 2019, back here, when this is what he meant by EPS. He meant the earnings per share prior to these two splits happening. So what he wanted to illustrate was, hey, General Motors earns more per share than Tesla does. Tesla has negative numbers, GM has positive numbers. Well, what's happened since that time? Tesla's earnings per share have grown, passing GM by a lot in 2021, and then by way more in 2022. So if Tesla hadn't done either of these splits, they would have reported $55 per share of earnings in 2022. That's a pretty good deal for people who were buying Tesla stock back here in 2014 when I first started buying, and Tesla was trading at about $200 per share. $55 worth of earnings per share would put that at, a PE of less than 4. That's a pretty good deal. And I sure do like the trajectory of this up and to the right growth on Tesla earnings. And that is all 4 charts, and that is my video for today. So we'll check back in on Loki, where all we can see are his ears. He was not tempted by the kibble, but he will eat his food later. And with that, I'll outro and say if you've enjoyed today's video, click the like button. Don't forget to also subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that already. You can just click the button over here and do that. Thank you to everyone who supports me, either through Patreon or by joining my YouTube channel, as my executive producers Kathy Kitchler and Halter Ferguson Financial did. And I'll see you in the next one.